Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are back with another episode of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution Radio, and that bumper was squirrely.
That was very long bumper or break, I should say.
And no introduction for the host except for 2 seconds there.
Yeah, that was a bit by surprise.
Well, happy solstice. Today is the shortest day of the year for the Northern Hemisphere and the longest day of the year for the Southern Hemisphere. And we are headed into the holiday season. Most people are off for the next 2 weeks. How do you like them apples?
Cool.
Well, we've got a great show today. We're going to do a two-part holiday special. We're going to start with the World Magnetic Model update. And then we're going to dive into some articles I've been talking about on Oppenheimer Ranch Project over the last few days, including one article, did we almost go extinct around 1 million years ago? And what actually makes us human? There is some new research coming out that is claiming that we are the same species as Neanderthals and Denisovans, which we posited here last week without even knowing that this research just came out.
Yeah, and actually, I was going to ask you, do you have a date on the paper that talks about this? Because I couldn't find one. It's just a preprint right now, which is why it doesn't have a date, but I
Yeah,
guess.
it's the 10th or something. I can show you that.
12/10?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it is around the 10th. But without further ado, if you have nothing else to say before we get started.
Nope.
I'll start by sharing the screen. Happy solstice. And for those that don't know, there is a winter and a summer solstice. And every 6 months they shift. And in this case, we are in winter in the Northern Hemisphere and summer in the Southern Hemisphere. So in places like Australia, it's the longest day of the year. And in places like Siberia, it's the shortest day of the year.
Mm-hmm.
And we would happen to be on the same side of the earth as Siberia. So it is the shortest day of the earth for us as well. Now, what's interesting is it's not the coldest time of year in the Northern Hemisphere. That happens after the solstice, which is counterintuitive.
Do you think that depends on where you are in the Northern Hemisphere?
Well, the reason is because weather is very short term and climate is long term, right? The same thing is happening on Earth in seasons. By December 21st, it's not the coldest in North America because things like lakes and streams and rivers aren't their coldest yet. They're still cooling down. So it takes a while. You have to get deep into winter, which is usually the end of January and the beginning of February. So another 4 weeks or so when everything is super chilled that you really get those cold temperatures in the morning.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think a lot of people don't understand that climate and weather is very complicated.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on, and CO2 and cow farts has very little to do with anything. We'd also like to wish you a Merry Christmas out there and a Happy New Year, but we will be back before the New Year on the 28th with another show. So Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
And yes, in fact, earlier this week, the World Magnetic Model 2025 was released. Now, what does that mean for you and I? Well, you're all going to be rewatching this tonight on Magnetic Reversal News. So almost 100% of the viewers then are probably concerned about this update and the magnetic excursion we're in. And I would think that the almost 100% of everyone listening on Revolution Radio right now also is aware of the magnetic excursion. So the World Magnetic Model only gets updated every 5 years. But this all changed 5 years ago. Prior to the last update, which would be the 2020 update, they had to update it in 2019 because the speed of the magnetic pole, the North Pole, was moving so fast, it had to be updated early because the numbers on runways and northern hemisphere shipping lanes, they were already incorrect.
Yeah.
So what that shows us is that the magnetic pole, the North Pole, is moving faster than it ever has in history since the inception of the World Magnetic Model.
It's interesting that it shows that modern technology is not always the best option, right? Like if you're using traditional compass methods, let's say for sea navigation, you're going to have a clearer location for the North Pole than you are if you're going to be using a GPS model.
Right. The problem with that is if it's 4 years after the world magnetic model is updated and you're using a compass and the current chart, you're going to be wrong.
Right.
Yeah. So we really need to keep this updated. Now, the world magnetic model is not completely updated. There is a paper that comes out in tandem with it that has not been updated yet. It is still the 2023 paper. But what we do have from the world magnetic model is a new graphic for the first time ever, where they show in real time the pole shift in the last 4 decades. And you can see it moving slowly here, and something happens right there where it accelerates.
Yeah.
You really can't see the acceleration too much on this, but you can see it starting off real slow there.
Yeah.
There is another graphic in the model that is much more impressive, and it's the historic magnetic declination viewer. We're going to use this throughout the show today, but let me just reset it here and move it back. So the green dot is the North Magnetic Pole, and this, I apologize to those on radio, you can't see it, but if you could see it, this gives a data set from 1590 to present. And if you move it through from 1590 to 1690, it's just bobbing around northern Canada there.
Mm-hmm.
And then 1690 to 1790, it's staying in the same spot. It's doing very little. So this is hundreds of years. And then 1790 to 1890, it doesn't do much either. So for 400 years, look what it does. It doesn't do much of anything. It's just bobbing and weaving up in northern Canada. But in 1940, something happened, and the pole started to rapidly move in one direction away from where it had been for hundreds of years. And that's where we are now. So if we watch the animation in real time from 1590 to present, you can see how slow the northern pole just is kind of willy-dilly. Every decade it moves 10 kilometers or so. Not like today, where we're moving 50 kilometers a year. It's only moving a few kilometers a decade back in the olden days. Something happens in 1859, the Carrington event, and we are now on a new path of the pole after the Carrington event, and it's still moving slowly until something happens in 2000. Watch what happens here in 2000. Whoa!
Right.
And the pole shoots to the north at a speed that is unprecedented, at such an unprecedented speed. Let's just watch it from 1950 to present. And here, as we approach 2000, it is kicked into high gear here, folks. And we haven't seen movement like this in the poles since the last magnetic excursion, which takes us back 12,000 years ago. And
and even if you're not really looking at the speed, just the geographical change, right? The North Pole is much closer to Siberia today, whereas before it was bouncing around northern Canada, so just the sheer difference of its location is pretty significant.
Right. And a lot of people predict that this is going to shoot right over to northern Siberia here, and in the same latitude or longitude here that it was before, and its new resting place will be over in Siberia for a long period of time. So it's just like shifting position on the globe. But others, like I think you and I know me, think that maybe it's going to be a little bit more nefarious and that we're going to get a full excursion, which means that this pole is going to end up somewhere near the equator before it snaps back.
Well, and the pole itself, regardless of where it's located, the degree of polarity would be lessened significantly.
The faster it moves away from where it was for a long period of time, the weaker the field gets.
Right.
There is still remnant northern magnetism here where the pole was for 500 years. That'll
Sure.
stay for another 100 or so years. But where this baby is moving to, there is no remnant magnetism. So it's very weak.
Well, but just generally speaking, with a overall weakened magnetic field, it's like the distribution of charge is much more even versus when the field strength is very high and it's highly polarized, you know?
Yeah, and what we have, some have hypothesized, and what has been demonstrated for some of the weakest excursions, like the Lechamp, is that when the field strength gets that low, other poles pop up out of nowhere. So you
Right, that
just
too.
don't have a north and south pole. You'll have north and south poles popping up across the Earth.
Right. And they won't be nearly as strong, let's say, as a system where you have a very strong north and a very strong south pole, because again, the magnetism has to be sort of distributed differently.
And it tends to be really chaotic with multiple poles where they're rapidly shifting and popping in and out.
Mm-hmm.
Here is the
Well,
current.
imagine how disruptive that is for animal life that relies on magnetic fields to navigate, etc. You know, and I think we've even seen some of that in the last 20 years, incidences of certain animals like getting lost seemingly on their navigation pattern or showing up in places where they did not before.
Yes, indeed. But it would be a boon to groups of humans that are trying to survive this time if civilization had crashed. Because if you were near the shore, you would have these whales being beached and it would be free food.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Easy pickings, as they say. So here are the current positions with the World Magnetic Model 2025 update. The North Pole is directly above Siberia. And take a look at this. It used to be over here.
Right.
It was over here in 1990.
That's amazing.
So,
Very
so
fast.
now the South Pole has not moved. It has not accelerated like the North Pole. It's been slowly moving offshore here of Antarctica at the same slow pace. So the South Pole is slightly anomalous and reacting much different than the North Pole. But the idea is, if you look at the green field lines, this is going to be the direction that the poles move. So the North Pole will continue to move towards northern Siberia here. It could accelerate and make its way to India in just 5 or 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And that the South Pole will be meeting it and maybe accelerate. See, look how much closer the South Pole is relative to where the North Pole is, relative to where we think they're going to meet here in Indonesia, right at this cusp. So the South Pole has less distance to move than the North Pole. And all of this distance can be covered at the rate it's moving now in just about 30 years. If it accelerates. There is no evidence it's accelerating. It accelerated from about 2000 to 2010. And then the 2010-15 numbers were slightly slower because it's a world magnetic model. It's a 5-year average. And then the 2015-2020 numbers are about the same. So in the last decade, the pole is still moving between 40 and 50 kilometers per year. When at its highest point, it was moving as much as 60 or 70 in the early 2000s. Now, nobody knows what's causing this. The arguments are everywhere. Can I open? Oh, let me see if I can open this up. So this is something that's pretty interesting. And this is a graph of the shift. Let me shrink this down. This is the speed at which the dipole is moving. It's either moving rapidly or slowly. And so it increases here from 1940. Remember what we saw on the first, on that bit? 1940 was the big change. In 1940, it slowed down all the way to 1940 in a 2-decade period, and then it rapidly increased in speed, and it's now moderating. And here is the projection that there's really going to be no change in speed.
Well, also look at the big dip after 1840, which may coincide with the Carrington event.
Yes, so 1840, it's over here for a different reason. Then we've got that shift right here in 1840 where it shifts direction. It's kind of interesting to start looking at these graphs.
Yeah.
And 1840 is the bottom. So this is when we've changed direction, the Carrington event occurs, and now we're on a new path of the pole.
Mm-hmm.
So we can look at a longer term time scale. We were just kind of looking at this little part of the graph.
Yeah.
This is a field strength graph. This is a speed in which the field is shifting. So they're different. This is the overall strength, which we would use to determine a magnetic excursion. Here is an excursion which lasted from about 7,000 to 4,000 years ago. And then prior to that was the Gothenburg, which is during the Younger Dryas event. And now we are definitely dipping into the next excursion. Let's just call it the modern excursion. And we can even look on longer terms here. So this drop down here is what we're looking at in this whole time scale. This 2,000 years on the bigger scale is right here. And so you can see here that magnetic excursion we showed you, the Gothenburg, and then the Mono Lake and the Lechamp. So we are almost approaching the bottom of a normal excursion. Yet there aren't articles being written about it. There's not a lot of scientists that agree with us, maybe a few hundred or thousand worldwide. And I wonder if it's cognitive dissonance along with wanting to fit in with the mainstream and not, willing to stir the pot, because for 3 decades, if you're a scientist, you either stay in your lane or you get canceled. And if anyone were to claim that we're entering a magnetic excursion that's in academia, I think they'd be canceled.
Well, and I think part of the problem too is that if you're going to make that claim, you're really going out on a limb in the sense that I don't think we have any way of predicting, let's say, how deep an excursion might be. Like it appears to us to be obvious that we're heading into one, but we don't know how severe it will be, right? It could just, for all we know, it could just stop tomorrow, right? And our magnetic field strength grows. So to make that statement, you're rolling the dice on your career, essentially. So maybe that's part of the problem.
Right. And when you look at the top geophysicists that are working on this, even the team at the World Magnetic Model Update, they say in the newest videos on geomagnetism and this excursion we're experiencing, that there's no way. They've been studying this for so long and they can't even predict a year out.
Right.
Let alone claim that we're in the excursion. It's continuing to drop down, but at any moment it can go up. They know that because of this graph.
Right.
Look at the black line here. It's going down, but then it recovers, but then it keeps going down. Then it recovers. Like, how do you not know on this recovery that it's not going to go high? You don't.
Well, and this is, again, the problem of kind of our perspective here, that we can't really zoom out far enough really to make any predictions, because we're living inside that black line, essentially, right? That's going up and down in small increments, but there may be a larger trend outside of that, especially from where we're sitting, we just can't see.
But we can certainly see it here, that for the last 2,000 years, we've been going down.
Right.
And for the last 700 years, it has rapidly decreased.
Right.
And based on new data, it's an exponential decrease and a speed up of its movement. So the field is getting weaker, and it's probably getting weaker because it's moving faster. Like we just discussed, the faster it moves, the weaker it gets. And then there's almost no field. Then there's multiple poles. And then we're in the excursion. You got UVA, UVB, you got every solar flare frying the earth, no matter how big it is. The shields are down, essentially. And we all become cavemen once again.
The irony of what I said earlier about that you're rolling the dice with your career if you try to make any predictions with this, because the prediction for a major excursion would also include some amount of catastrophe for life on Earth, right? Because of the influx of UVA, BC. We've talked about this many times, right? That we would have less of a magnetic shield. We would be subject to far more radiation previously, and that there's a very good possibility that that is linked to extinctions and mutations. So what's funny is you would also be going out on a limb suggesting that we're in danger of major changes in, let's say, speciation on Earth, extinction,
Exactly.
mutation, etc. But at the same time, there's no compunction about claiming that we're all going to burn up and die, in 5 years. Isn't that funny?
It is. And this is a great segue to the whole rest of the show. These magnetic excursions do a few things. They cause hominids to run and hide in caves when they realize it's dangerous to be outside.
Mm-hmm.
And then they isolate themselves, and they isolate themselves for dozens or hundreds of generations. And by doing that, they become very unique, different subgroups of humans. And for all of vertebrate paleontology, many anthropologists have been referring to these hominids as different species, and there is no reason for that. And I have lots of evidence that we're going to have up here by the end of the show that if an alien species of anthropologists came here and all humans were dead due to some catastrophe, they would think that the people that are referred to as Mongoloids or Asians would be a different species than people referred to as Africans, would be a different species than those referred to as Caucasians. And there are scientific papers that will pull up to prove this.
Yeah,
And
that's
I
what I've been
don't
saying in the last week since we first brought this up. But that's what occurred to me. Like the different races on Earth, anthropologically, paleontologically speaking, would look pretty different from each other. I mean, just look at the differences in our morphology right now.
Yeah, look at the people on Samoa and compare them to people in Japan.
Right.
They would be, I mean, come on.
Right.
Yeah, there is no way
Which
you
is
would.
interesting, which is interesting even just from the perspective that you could say that both of those groups of people are Asians, but yet they're morphologically so different from each other.
Right.
We're only calling them Asians because of where they currently are on Earth, essentially. I mean, I'm sure there's some, genetic similarity that, let's say, I would not have with a Samoan person by any means, but it's very interesting. Well, I think there's another thing, and we'll get to this, but there's another thing that I think is important that comes up with this is that you could, well, and I think we know this already, that it is not necessarily the case that morphological difference and genealogical difference match up all that well. I mean, look at dogs, right? All dogs are the same species.
Oh,
We've,
I'm going to blow your mind in a minute.
But we've selectively bred them, right, to have different behaviors, and therefore they end up looking very different from each other. They're morphologically very different, but genealogically they're not going to be that different.
Yeah, they're all the same genus and species.
Mm-hmm.
Canis familiaris.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not related to foxes in any way, as some people think. Foxes are so far removed from dogs. We'll get to that.
I mean, they are related to wolves, but not foxes.
They can interbreed with wolves, so they're probably still the same species. And we'll get to that.
Yes.
So it was selection of the wolf that got us all the dogs. So all dogs are wolves.
My ex-husband, in fact, had a wolf dog hybrid.
Oh, that's crazy. They're not good
Yeah.
pets.
Yeah.
All right. So first, some good news. It's taken decades, but finally, the stupid hypothesis that ancient humans, the Clovis people, hunted all of the giant megafauna to extinction is finally coming to a rest. And that is because of sites all around the Americas that date 10,000 or more years earlier, like the footprints in White Sands and a South American sloth kill site that is dating in Brazil that dates back to 27,000 years. Mm-hmm. And so the paleontologists and anthropologists are saying, wait a minute, if humans were here for 17,000 years with these megafauna, how come it took them that long to kill them off? It doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. Because it's not true. Right. So they're going to have to come with terms that there was a cosmic catastrophe 12,900 years ago that caused this extinction.
There's a weird, almost like narcissism in these ideas, or we constantly, academics constantly throw out these ideas that humans are responsible for major extinctions. This narrative comes up again and again and again. It's the same thing as claiming that we have such power over the climate, when in reality I think that the cosmos and our Earth climate has far more power than we ever would. It's kind of silly in one respect to think that we have so much power over the giant mammals, and non-mammals of the past, that we're always the cause of their extinction.
Oh, I was muted. Sorry about that. Well, yeah, that is stupid. But here's another interesting thing. If we did arrive in the New World at some point, let's say there were no hominids here and we got here 50,000 years ago. The group that got here, that stayed here for tens of thousands of years, are going to develop and look much different than people that have been developing in Africa for 1,000,000 years. And even if those Africans take a boat over and say hi, we're going to look different. But are we going to look different? That is the next question. And that brings us to this article. Did humans go extinct 900,000 years ago? Now, what they found is fascinating, that and they're using something here which is outdated and kind of useless these days. It's called FitCol. And FitCol is an estimator for population demographics. The problem is it doesn't include genetics. And now with all the breakthroughs in genetics, what they just found is that FitCol is garbage, and that anything older than a few 100,000 years is going to get garbage results. But with genetic sequencing, what they find is if you take all of the samples we have of Neanderthal and Denisovan and Sapien, and you look at them, the mutations reverse back to a common ancestor. So what it appears is if 1,000,000 years ago, us humans were isolated in 3 or more regions for a long period of time, and we became different groups of the same species. We became what we call Cro-Magnon. We became Neanderthal, Denisovan, Dragon Man, Floriensis, wherever they were isolated for hundreds of generations, I think we became that group, which explains why Asians look Asian and Africans look African and Indians look Indian and Caucasians look Caucasian. And even though we've been mixing for hundreds of thousands of years and interbreeding, we are still maintaining that uniqueness based on geography. Isn't that amazing? You would think that we would all look the same at this point. But that's not the case.
Well, I mean, I think it goes to show that it takes a very long time of genetic mixing in order to produce those morphologic differences. And then as you mentioned, the problem with FitCol is apparently that it's based on quite a lot of assumption. And then the way I see it is that this tendency for these kinds of models to always lead back to a common ancestor, to my mind, it seems like that would make it hard to tell if we're actually looking at a common ancestor or if we are looking at periods of isolation, right? Because periods of isolation are going to produce something similar to a common ancestor because you have less genetic mixing. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And then the question becomes, what makes us human? What is the defining factor? And if we are, in fact, the same as Neanderthals and Denisovans, but just look different, like Chihuahuas and German Shepherds, very different looking animals, same species, what defines a species? Here is the problem with science. It's broken. All of paleontology is broken because we don't understand evolution. No one does. And defining a species is based on words that we made up. It's often defined in the most basic terms as groups of individuals that can actually or potentially interbreed. And that's what makes a species. The only problem is modern science doesn't follow the definition, because lions and tigers can mate and make ligers, but they're different species, because I think they're wrong. The way that we define things in science was made up. And here's a perfect example. Until genetic testing was possible 10 years ago, all of the paleontologists and taxonomists, if you don't know what a taxonomist is, those are the guys that group all the animals in these, nice little branchy things called phylogenetic trees.
It started with the Linnaean system, Linnaeus, right? Started grouping animals this way, and then it turned into this phylogenetic tree process.
Right. And it's based on, back then, they didn't have genetics. It was based on observations and morphology. Do they look the same? Do they do the same things? Do they nest the same? And so falcons and hawks were put in the same group because one's just a smaller version of the other. The problem is, once genetic testing came out, they found out that falcons have nothing to do with hawks. They're not even on the same timeline. They reverse back into the parrot line. Falcons are parrots. They were never raptors until recently. They recently became a meat-eating parrot, and they're now falcons. And they're not related to hawks at all, but due to their isolation and the way that they've evolved, they look very similar. And so that's some of the problems with taxonomy and species. We get it so wrong based on morphology that we really don't know what's happening. And the other problem is the phylogenetic trees and taxonomy in general. All of these V-points require something called the missing link. And at no point has a single missing link at any of these splits ever been found. So based on that, and the hundreds of thousands of paleontologists that have been looking in the fossil record, they haven't found a single missing link to explain how you get from one species to the next. Something else is going on. And what's going on in the 90s was explained by Niles Eldredge and Stephen Gould, Jay Gould. Punctuated equilibria. Something is happening at these flexure points to cause instantaneous speciation. They explained it by something called exaptation. And you alluded to that. Exaptation occurs, let's say, 1 million years ago at the quote unquote hominid bottleneck. We were separated on 3 or 4 different continents and completely cut away from each other because it was so difficult to live. We couldn't travel. There was no way we're going to migrate anywhere. We're just stuck trying to live. And it works out. And over thousands, tens of thousands of years, each group of people looks completely different. And then there's a time when we can migrate and travel. We meet these groups, even though they look different. There's nothing else on Earth that is a bipedal human. So even though Cro-Magnon met the Neanderthal, they still thought they were humans. They just look different. It's like a white person meeting an African. It's still a person. It's just a black guy, and I'm a white guy. That's
something I was thinking about last week after we talked about all of this on our show that occurred to me to be probably very important. Consider the way that we look at bestiality today, right? Which in essence is just essentially trying to reproduce with a species that is not human, right? So if, and I don't believe it is, but if it were the case that Neanderthal was a different species than Homo sapien, and I believe strongly that we would have a very strong, intuitive, like ick response to the idea of trying to reproduce with another species. I don't think we would have been interbreeding with Neanderthals simply on the basis of like there's some biological imperative that says don't do that. Just consider how we would look at that today. Like if a bipedal alien hominid suddenly showed up on Earth, like I think the vast majority of humans would have a a a disgusting response to the idea of interbreeding with those aliens. So that tells me that we must have known that we were the same species as Neanderthal, as Denisova, etc.
Right. And so they're doing them a disjustice by not naming them sapiens, because sapiens are wise or attempting to appear wise or relating to the human species. And so Neanderthals and Denisovans buried their dead and made jewelry and lived in built structures. They were all sapiens. So when we finally traveled across the ocean to meet the Denisovans, we didn't think they weren't humans. Of course they're humans. We were fascinated how different they were, and they used different tools and had different dances. It's very similar to Native American cultures. A lot of them don't look the same. The Apaches don't look like the Utes. They don't look like the Zuni. And they all have different dances and different gods, but do similar things because they're all sapiens. They're all wise or attempting to appear wise. And so the fact that, and I think it has to do with the Ooga Booga movement, right?
Yeah.
These were cavemen, and they beat the women over the head with clubs, and they were not like us, when in fact they were us. We are them.
But you know what's really funny? So the preprint paper that this article is based on that we're talking about here, this idea that, and this preprint paper, right, it introduces the idea with good evidence that we are the same species as Neanderthal and Denisova. Denisova, I always say that wrong. And it is based on something pretty significant that happened genetically that happened prior to our, let's say, our split from Neanderthal and Denisova. However, they also say, based on some other stuff that they looked at, they clearly state that they think that Homo sapiens were far more intelligent than Neanderthal, which I don't necessarily buy, for the reason that you just stated. So they say that there are some genes that relate to cognitive functioning that we have, like, newer mutations of that Neanderthal largely did not get. And they're using that to say that Neanderthal was not as high functioning cognitively.
That's interesting. So here is the genome sequencing. This is event 1. This is when we're all Homo sapiens. And then we split into sapiens, Neanderthal, Denisovan at 650 kiloyear. That is the same time that corresponds with the shift from a 41,000 year ice age to a 104,000 year ice age, which may begin the isolation of our species.
Yes.
And we stay isolated for almost the entire ice age, only mingling at the interstadials, which is a few thousand years every 100,000, where it's warm enough to take ships on ocean journeys. And that's when the genes begin mixing. 650 to present, which is why we should still say
remixing, right? Because really the thing is that we were the same thing. And the reason we know this from this study is for 2 reasons. There are 2 ancestral chromosomes that formed human chromosome 2, and Neanderthal and Denisova share this trait. So that tells us that we are the same as them. And the other reason, same thing, that Neanderthal and Denisova also share this. There's a genomic region called PAR2, which stands for pseudo-autosomal region 2, which shifted this area from the X chromosome to the Y. And Neanderthal and Denisova also share this. This is the reason why they say that we are all part of the same species. So, and that happened probably around, or I think it's more specific than that. It's like 856,000 years ago. So prior to the split. So, then the split happens, but then we come back together again to some degree.
Yeah, interesting. And on their red line here, it shows that Denisova has no variety throughout the length of its existence, which is about 1 million years. Although they just found Dragon Man and all those others, those are all Denisovan. They're all from Asia. And so the big head man, those are all Denisovans. They've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 subspecies of Neanderthal. This is leading you to, so these subspecies were all interbreeding with each other. They could have also bred with Denisovans or sapiens. And so
it may just be maybe the difference, the difference, let's say, between breeding between sapiens and Neanderthal that occurs after 350,000 years ago, the difference may just be geographical. Right? Like it may have been more opportunities to interbreed between quote unquote sapiens and Neanderthals than there were sapiens and Denisova and Neanderthal.
Yeah. And the reason we keep this separation is based on the size, shape, and morphology of the skulls. That is how they've split these. So if you do a cursory search on current humanity, the size, shape, and skull of various different races is completely different. And a paper that came out, don't have a date. This is coming out from the Sivina Dental College in Chennai.
2014.
Okay. Racial variations in different skulls. The initial breakdown in a cursory review shows there are 3 main categories of human skulls, which you cannot deny. They don't look the same, and when you pick them up, they're completely different. There's Caucasoid, Negroid, and Mongoloid. But now, if you take all of the skulls known from all humans, you can break it down even further into 5 subgroups, which are all exactly the same. All the Nordics have all the same skull length, skull breadth, skull height, and they're all different. Each of them is different. We have Nordic, Alpine, Mediterranean, Negroid, and Mongoloid. And so what you're looking at here is Denisovan, right? Neanderthal, and sapien, or more mixing. Because what we know is 1 million years ago, there's ghost genetics. And there are probably 10, maybe even 20 other hominids we don't even know about yet that we were also mingling with. Because there were people living in Siberia. There were people living on islands. What we know is less than 1% of the fossil record at any given time, which means 99% of humanity is unknown to us. But what we do know is that the people living on Earth today all look different. And if I was an anthropologist, I would say they were different species based on morphology, taxonomy, and all the things they currently use. So science needs a full reworking, especially in the field of vertebrate paleontology, paleontology in general. And without new theories and new scientific endeavors to understand things like the term evolution, which is just a bad word to explain speciation through time, there needs to be a new word. And evolution is not it.
Well, I mean, you could still call it that, but the understanding of what that means would need to change. I mean, the replacement right now would be like genetic change, right? Which is essentially means the same thing. I mean, the concept, where the concept of evolution really needs reworking, you alluded to this earlier in the show. It's this problem where in any phylogenetic tree that there's the missing link that we never find, right? And the missing link is like, it's kind of like a chicken and the egg question, right? It's that at the point of divergence, how does it work out that because if there's a let me go back a second. So what was discovered and written about in this paper that determines that Neanderthals and Denisova are the same species as us, these major genetic changes, it's postulated that those changes would have kind of created kind of like a different hominid species that would have been unable to breed with other hominid species. So what we now today call Neanderthal, Denisova, and Homo sapien would be able to interbreed with each other, but not other hominids. So there probably is some point where that happens, but in order for that to happen, you need at least 2 of that new hominid to appear, and it has to be a male and a female in order for this to work. That's the missing link that we never find. And I think the reason we never find it is because this evolution doesn't happen the way that we think it does. I think it is punctuated equilibria, like you alluded to, and I believe that that is caused by magnetic excursions and reversals, right? It's the fire and ice. What causes mutation is probably incoming radiation. That's when we see extinctions. That's when we see new species arising. So it's not just, it's not just two individuals that suddenly appear being completely different and then the tree splits. It's that the conditions, the magnetic conditions change, and suddenly you've got a bunch of hominids with a change in their genetics.
Yeah, I agree there, but that's not the only explanation for speciation,
Sure,
because
sure.
we know about hybridization. So
Yeah.
you could have times where other catastrophes, like a comet hits, the magnetic field's fine, but the earth is
Sure.
on fire and there's only two birds left that were close together, but they can mate, and they never tried to, but they do, and the hybrid they create can only mate with its hybrid, and then that hybrid is a new species.
Hmm.
So I believe that's happened in the past due to catastrophic shock of the biome. And that's what the whole idea of punctuated equilibria exaptation comes into. There is, like I was explaining to you, we've got a gallbladder that really doesn't do anything,
An appendix.
an appendix.
The
But at
gallbladder
some,
does do stuff, but the
yeah, the
appendix does not.
appendix at some
Yeah.
point in our past, maybe prior to us with the Neanderthals and all that, maybe a million years ago, the appendix was doing something.
Yeah. I was
Maybe
just
it was
reading the
like
other.
killing off bacteria because we're eating raw meat and we needed another thing in our tract to kill off some bacteria or something.
Right, right.
But
I was
then we
just reading
learned
the
to
other.
cook food, and then we didn't need the appendix anymore because we didn't have that bacteria.
Right. I was just reading the other day that apparently like 8% of all humans today have these muscles on the top of their sternum that don't do anything, So it's like obviously some genetic relic that served a purpose at some point in the past and no longer does. So it's just
Yeah.
it's just slowly disappearing.
Now, look at this phylogenetic tree. The turtle split off from the pigeon 4.9 million years ago. Yeah. Clearly, there's some issues. And here is Canis familiaris and Canis lupus. The gray wolf and the modern dog are the same. They're the same species. We just split them because we hybridize them so much. They look so different. We claim they're different, but they aren't different. You could take any dog and mate it with a wolf and get a dog.
Hmm. A
So
dog
this
wolf,
is
but
some
it's
of the
still, yeah,
issues here.
yeah. And the
A
the
coyote, go ahead.
well, the morphological differences are purely environmental, right? I mean, and I'll just cite there's a very famous study that was done, I don't know, 20 or 30 years ago in Russia with foxes, right? And what they did is that they bred the foxes for temperament. They bred a group of docile foxes and a group of aggressive foxes, and part of the result of that was very significant morphological differences. So, differences in coat color, and I think size was part of it, et cetera, et cetera. So essentially what that study showed was that, breeding for temperament, it means that the genes that determine temperament are linked to certain morphological characteristics. And that's just all pressure from human breeding, right? So whether it's human breeding that's creating morphological differences, such as in the case of dogs, where we breed dogs for specific physical characteristics, uh, it I kind of lost my train of thought there, but it's all outside pressure, whether it's humans or environmental.
Well, yeah, and take a look at this taxonomy here. All the Volpes can interbreed, yet they have three separate species.
Hmm.
Yet in the common fox, we've got the red fox, the gray fox. They're different sizes. One can climb metal, the other can't. One can climb tree. They're completely different, but they're the same. They can interbreed and have mixed foxes. They created their own, they isolated themselves at some point, and the gray fox became the gray fox and the red fox became the red fox, but they're all the same common fox.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's the earth can naturally do what humans did to dogs. They did it to the earth did it to foxes.
Right. Well, and it does again go back to this idea of, certain traits are genetically linked to other traits, right? Because otherwise, if the environmental pressure was selecting for some particular characteristic, the result would be random, but it's not random, right? Like certain genes are, along the same, they're connected to each other. So you're going to get similar morphological differences amongst, like, let's say the red fox, that allows the red fox to come into being as an entity unto its own.
Right, and survival of the fittest is at play. Forget the foxes, let's take a look at the wolves. The red wolf, the gray wolf, and the coyote can all breed. That's why we have different types of coy wolves. So the coyote, the red wolf, and the gray wolf, and all dogs are all the same. They're all dogs. And the reason a coyote is because it's a wolf that lives in the desert. There's less food. It's hot. There's no water. So they're scrawny little wolves. They selected for themselves to become a coyote. They can still breed with wolves. They cross paths, like in regions where we are, where wolves are to the north and coyotes are here. They do interbreed, and there are coy wolves. There's red and gray wolves that are interbreeding. There's red wolves and coyotes. There's gray wolves and coyotes that interbreed because they're the same species. I think we got it wrong here, folks.
Yeah. Well, it's funny too, right? Because I remember, I don't know exactly when this was, maybe like 20 years ago or something, that it was discovered that polar bears and grizzly bears can interbreed. It's called a pizzly, and that was like this huge revelation. But in reality, it's not really that amazing because they're just the same species that have separated on morphological lines based on environmental selective pressure. I mean, it makes sense, right? A polar bear is white because of where it lives. Hello.
Right. A few albinos were born, they made it better, and they had more babies, and then they were all white.
Right.
It's pretty simple. It gets even crazier. We'll leave you links to all of the taxonomy. Do you know about the story of the bonobo and the chimp?
No, I don't.
They don't even think that taxonomically and paleontologically, they separate these completely by genus. They're not related at all. But when genetic testing came out, they're 99.6% the same. The difference is that one walks upright and the other one doesn't. The bonobo stands and walks. The chimpanzee is on all fours. The bonobo is smaller. The chimpanzee is bigger. They can interbreed. They can interbreed though, but they're different genuses.
I mean, looking at this image, it's like looking at the image of 4 different races or 2 different races on Earth.
Right. Neanderthals and or Neanderthals and Homo sapiens.
Or like Asian Islanders and Caucasians or something. It's like
and they're genetically different because these guys stay on one side of the continent, these guys stay on the other, and they seldom intermix.
Yeah.
So over periods of tens of hundreds of thousands of years, the genetics are going to be off by 0.5%.
Yep.
So I think we've got a lot of reworking to do as far as it comes to genetics.
Well, and maybe one of the biggest impediments is this idea that, all evolution starts with a common ancestor. I mean, I think what we're showing pretty distinctly that there's a pulse that happens, right? Where we have periods of time where we're able to come together geographically and interbreed, and then we separate and we isolate, creating morphological differences. And that's probably happening again and again and again. So I don't know that it really even makes sense at this point to say that somewhere along the way back when, there was a common ancestor, nor am I clear that we could even be able to determine that by looking at the genomic information. Oh.
Great show.
Well, yeah. Find us tonight on Magnetic Reversal News at 8 p.m. Mountain Time on YouTube.
And Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
listening to Revolution Radio.